give me your full name as it is recorded on your birth certificate?
Yes, it's George L. Fisher, Fisher.
Do you have a nickname?
Yeah, known as Lee.
Did you acquire that nickname while you were in the service?
No, a few other ones, but no. The Lee is shortened for the middle name, which is Leroy.
Okay. Where were you born and raised, sir?
I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, raised there. My family since spent some time in West Virginia, and then, like a lot of other West Virginia families, they moved away from West Virginia to find work when I was a little kid. But I never forgot West Virginia. That's the reason I'm back here now.
All right. What was your job in the military?
Well, I was drafted. Conscription was going on then. I went in and got my draft notice and went in the latter part of '68, went through basic training in the Army, early part of '69 in advanced infantry training, then went to Vietnam in June of '69, and at the time, even though you had an MOS or a military occupation specialty, you never really knew what you were going to do because we were all assigned to these big assignment centers, called out in a formation every morning, and they would call your name and you step forward and they'd say, okay, you're going to go to this unit. Now, I happened to be assigned to the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam. Got to the 101st headquarters in the northern part of Vietnam, waited around there for a few days until they decided they needed me in a spot, and so I went to work, got assigned, I should say, to the 47th Scout Dog Platoon. That was a platoon of dog handlers that operated attached to infantry units. I spent a lot of months with the dogs, and then when I was getting ready to go home, the Army wanted me to re-enlist. I said I would only re-enlist if I got a job in the rear, and actually told them I would only re-enlist if I got my MOS, that's that military occupation specialty, changed. Because I knew they would keep me. So I sort of, maybe for the only time in my whole service career, pulled a fast one on the Army because they thought I would re-enlist, and eventually got transferred for the last 2 months to a combat engineer company where I was a mail clerk. So actually for Vietnam guys, there were so many people being lost at the time that regardless of what your MOS was, they plugged you into a hole where you were needed. And that could be really anywhere, and I'm sure my story's not that much different than hundreds of thousands of guys that thought they were going to be X and turned out to be Y.
Since you were drafted, were you able to select which part of the service to join, or were you just assigned a branch?
Most early on, even in basic training with the Army, they would assign you to a particular base that specialized in particular MOSs or particular jobs. I was at Fort Benning because I went through infantry school, and then I went through advanced infantry training. So I came out of there trained as an infantryman. But I knew, to give you an idea, I knew in Vietnam of guys that were trained as infantrymen and wound up working in supply. Again, because it was how many bodies they were short in certain specialties, and that's where you got slotted.
So they basically put you where they needed you.
I, in fact, can tell you that all of the services in Vietnam when I was there were running so short of people that we got called out in a formation a couple of days, and they said the first 25 step forward, you're going to the Army. The next 25 step forward, you're going to the Marines.
Huh.
The next group step forward, assigned them to the Navy. So these were all Army guys. Where they must have had some inter-service agreements there in Vietnam to fill these manpower slots. So you won't find that many Vietnam vets that did that. But I know a guy, for instance, that spent most of his time loading ships in a Navy Yard, yet he was trained by the Army.
Huh. What do you remember most about your service in the military?
I had gotten out of high school, graduated from college, was ready to go out into the world. But I'd really never been away from Ohio that much. Never really been away from my family. And like millions of men and women before me, all of a sudden I realized they're not there anymore. It's me.
Yeah.
So I was faced, like a lot of young people at the time, with situations where I had never had to make the kinds of decisions about myself that I had to make. Never been confronted with the same situations that I was then confronted with. Yeah. So I had to learn real quick, and I'm no different than anyone else, that I had to really to think on my own 2 feet.
Yeah.
By myself and for myself. And that was probably the biggest, I wouldn't say shock, but that was probably the biggest adjustment to me. Because I was a college graduate and cocky and thought I knew everything, and 6 weeks later got into situations where I realized that the Army didn't think I knew anything.
Yeah.
But had to think for myself. And I think in general, most veterans that I talk to will tell you that it made you grow up a lot quicker than you would have if you were laying on your parents' couch.
Yeah. What was your first unit or duty station?
My first duty station was Fort Benning. Of course, this was in training. I then went to Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri for demolition training. How to blow things up, because obviously I guess they figured they needed those kinds of people to do those kinds of things. I thought that I would be able to avoid Vietnam by volunteering for jump school. And again, being the cocky person that I thought I was, thought, well, I'll go to jump school and they'll see how bright and intelligent I am, and I'll be good at this, and I'll just make myself an instructor and stay home while everybody else goes. Well, that lasted for about 6 weeks, and those orders to Vietnam still came.
How did you feel about your first assignment?
I think like any new situation, it was bewildering. It was new. It was interesting.
Yeah. Until
you realized that, well, this wasn't going to be the life for the rest of your tour. And through all these stages, and again, my story is no different than anyone else's, you're thrown in with new people who you've never met before in basic training. After basic training, those people may disappear because they're going to be stationed at different places, learning different things.
Yeah.
Next level of advanced infantry training, again, you're thrown into a situation with new people. Shipping out, Vietnam, new situation with another new group of people. Next level, getting assigned to the 101st Airborne, another group of people. So it took me a while going through the training process to get to the point where I was going to be with guys for a given period of time. But I think most service people understand, regardless of the branch that you're in, that you're there with these people that have been trained, have had the same levels of training you have. Mm-hmm. It was really the first time in my life that I was ever put into a situation where I very quickly had to come to understand that those guys were there to support me, and I was supposed to pick up the slack and support them, and they would do that. They would do that through some pretty atrocious situations. So that's a feeling that not everybody gets to experience in their life. Yeah. And because of the situation, those bonds I think that you form with some people that you're in the service with, in some ways can be the strongest bonds that you ever form with anyone in your entire life. Mm-hmm. Life changes and you do different things and you form different bonds, but not for the same kinds of purposes. In most combat situations, that was obviously to keep you alive and you to keep them alive.
Speaking of combat, did you experience combat?
Yeah, I was probably in country in Vietnam, and again I was in the I Corps in the northern part of Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Vietnam was divided into corps. Okay. 1 Corps, 2 Corps, 3 Corps, and 4 Corps, going north to south. I was probably in country a month, and we got rocketed and mortared one night at nighttime when everybody was asleep. And up to that point I thought, well, this is going to be a pretty cushy situation. Yeah. And then all of a sudden that first instance sort of made me understand, well, one, it's not going to be too cushy. And there are people out there that will try to kill you. Mm-hmm. So that first situation, I thought about that a lot over the years. Yeah. It's probably a good thing that happened while I was there, because I had not gone on my first field operation yet. Mm-hmm. So when I did go on that first field operation, I realized it wasn't a joke anymore.
So it prepared you more for...
Oh yeah, mentally. Mentally, yes.
What engagements or battles did you experience then?
I think before my field tour was over, it's difficult for me to remember the exact battles that the Army called them. Uh-huh. Vietnam was unlike, say, a World War II situation or maybe a Korean situation, in that most of these missions, field missions, and chances that you would get into a battle were done on the individual unit level. Mm-hmm. Most of the time you were responsible for a certain AO or area of operations. Okay. And you might walk, before your tour was over, you might walk that area of operations 30 or 40 times. Mm-hmm. Hopefully not getting fired at, but it was the enemy there was so elusive. Mm-hmm. that it was almost impossible to predict what movements your unit was going to have to make from day to day. Most of the time, we'd get a call at night saying, we've got a mission tomorrow, and the NCOs would speak with the officers and go over sort of, if you want to call them, all the battle plans and propose tactical movements and that sort of thing. And that word would get passed down to the squad leaders, mm-hmm. who in turn would come back, and usually those were NCOs. E5s, Sergeant E5s. They would usually come back to your individual squad and say, okay, we're going to lift off tomorrow at 0700, and here's basically where we're going to go, and we're going to sweep. And that could be walking for 2 or 3 days. That could be walking for 1 day, getting lifted out. So you just really had to be flexible enough to know that those things were going to change.
Being in combat must have been very stressful. How did you relieve the stress after a battle was over?
I think, like most soldiers, I engaged in somewhat dark sense of humor things. Vietnam guys were very superstitious. And any Vietnam veteran listening to this years from now will understand this. When I first got there, I was a newcomer or a cherry. I don't know if you've heard that phrase before.
Yes.
And it was almost like being a servant or a gopher until you got to the point where you could prove yourself. Okay. And then as you survived, depending upon whatever your tour was, you became the old guy, and the replacements sort of became your cherries. But that was, I think that was the Vietnam soldiers' way of saying, we don't know you, we don't know what you're capable of, we don't know how you're going to react when the going gets tough, and until you show us that, until you earn our respect, you're not going to get it. Yeah. And there were all kinds of superstitions. I mean, the mind, the human mind is such a magnificent creation that it protects itself at all costs. I knew guys that from simple things like would not shave to wouldn't put on new uniforms, would only want to walk in certain spots in that file. All of us, I guess, foolishly thinking that those things would preserve us, but we all did what we could. And I think the other thing that you learn is life can be difficult, but if you're confronted with situations where people are trying to kill you and you're tasked with maybe taking somebody else's life, that the rest of the things in life really aren't that important enough to get worked up over. So it can be terrifying, but I remember plenty of operations where we probably lost more people to heat stroke and non-related combat things than we did to actual combat. And you have to understand, I'm not a big person anyhow. I probably weighed 120 pounds. At any one time, the school group asked me this a couple of years ago. At any one time, I think I was probably carrying 40 or 50 pounds to be prepared when I went out.
Yeah.
And if I look back on it now, and if I look back on some of my old pictures, I even say to myself, there's no way I could have ever done that. Or there's no way that I did do it.
Yeah.
But I obviously did what I had to do. Not only to survive, but the other thing that you develop is you form that bond with people, and it's a bond where you know that person to the right of you, and you know that person to the left of you will actually lay down their life for you if they have to. that's a bond that most people, fortunately maybe, never have to experience it. But once you do, and you understand that American service people have always sacrificed, it's a pretty strong feeling.
Yeah. Why did you fight? Was it patriotism, hatred of the enemy, fear of cowardice, for your friends?
I'd like to think that I was patriotic when I was in my early 20s, and I guess in an early 20s way I was. I came from a family of people who have served, had served. So that certainly, there was some of this service built into the image that I had of family. Okay. And I think that's probably the one strongest inducement that most Vietnam guys had, in that many of their fathers and their uncles and maybe really older brothers, maybe their grandmothers had served in World War II. I think it's also safe to say that I quickly forgot about all that stuff when I got into situations where I had to think about surviving and had to think about the survival of people next to me. So there weren't many times that we did sit around and talk about why we were there. Later in my tour, and I served from June of '69 until August of 1970. There certainly were questions that came up about, what are we doing here? What have we accomplished? What have we gained? What have we lost? And I think there was a certain amount of cynicism that was going through the ranks then.
Yeah.
Not only of draftees, but of career people who planned, whose life had been centered around the Army or the Marines and the Navy. But you certainly fought to stay alive, and you fought and fired and did the things you had to do to try to keep your friends alive too. I think that's probably been a motivating force through most soldiers through America's history. Let everybody else worry about that other stuff. We'll do what we can to get through the day.
Yeah. How long was it after the war until you were able to talk about what had happened during the war?
I had somewhat of a unique situation in that I was engaged to my current wife of many, many years now before I went. I think I purposely persuaded her that we should not get married because lurking in the back of my mind was I didn't want to make her a widow because I didn't know what I was going to be faced with. Though I came home and was married only 10 days after I got home. So I was virtually right out of the jungle. I hadn't slept in a real bed for probably over 2 years. Was somewhat angry about being forced to do what I had to do. Was still combative. Would fight even at 120 pounds. It didn't make any difference to me. And I harbored a lot of those feelings and emotions about what had happened there for a long time. I was fortunate in that I had a very caring family around me. I had a new wife whose father was a military person, retired guy. She knew the military way of life. She knew military types. She was only a young girl herself, so I think to a certain extent she probably looked past all of the negative things that were going on in my life at that point. I reclaimed my job. I eventually retired as an executive for a big railroad. Spent most of my career in the railroad. It was probably sometime in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So probably 10 years after I came back that I thought, I'm still troubled by this stuff.
Yeah.
So it was probably in the 80s that I first used in the company in what was called at the time an EAP program, an employee assistance program,
mm-hmm.
where I actually went, and this was really in the beginnings of people and professionals just starting to understand that maybe we better start getting these Vietnam guys to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
Because has been a horrible issue of alcohol and drug abuse, and life just really going down the tubes. In fact, some of my friends that I served with never did recover from what they went through mentally,
mm-hmm.
and that led to physical problems and all kinds of other things. But I was fortunate that I had a pretty solid structure around me, and it was also under the encouragement of my wife that said, maybe you better go talk to somebody about this. Because face it, it's just not the kinds of things that you can sit down and have a normal conversation about. Yeah. And that's no different than the men and women coming back today.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden you're thrust from this situation where your life's potentially in danger, or friends around you have lost their lives, and that's not the kind of thing that people are going to break into conversation about over Easter dinner.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad that the younger men and women of today have had a lot of attention paid to them mm-hmm. about these services being available to them, and in fact they are encouraged to use these services. Vietnam guys were no different than anybody else. They just came back and were expected to suck it up mm-hmm. and go about doing their normal thing, and most of them did that, like me. Got married, had kids, had jobs, had responsible jobs. Mm-hmm. But Vietnam veterans are very, very vocal people. They're probably the most politically vocal group of veterans that we've ever had. Yeah. And they're not afraid. There's no fear of saying to anyone, you need to do this mm-hmm. because we deserve that. Or you owe us that. Vietnam veterans have never been hesitant about doing that, and I credit a lot of that political and social work that Vietnam veterans voiced about that have turned into the services that we're offering younger men and women today.
Okay. What was your opinion that you had of your officers while you were in the service?
Like in any situation, you ran into some decent guys. Mm-hmm. There are a couple of breakdowns. There were a lot more ROTC programs back then on campuses.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of people that had gotten into those programs, very much like the guardsmen of today, thinking, well, even though it didn't cost anything to go to college then, I'll do this ROTC thing and I'll get the Army to pay for it, mm-hmm. or I'll get the Air Force to pay for it. So that hasn't changed. But you had situations in Vietnam where maybe the guy that was your fraternity brother mm-hmm. had gone through ROTC and you had not. Yeah. And you meet 2 years later and he's an officer and you're still a draftee. So in a lot of ways, those guys were only following orders like we all had to. Mm-hmm. But there were these career people that thought themselves to be master tacticians, mm-hmm. master planners, that unfortunately I think we're still trying to plan for victory in Vietnam the way they tried to prepare in World War II in Korea. And they came to understand very quickly that those World War II and Korea plans weren't worth the paper they were written on. Mm-hmm. So a lot of those guys were career guys. They were arrogant. You've probably heard this phrase, body counts. All they were concerned about was body counts. Mm-hmm. Probably more concerned with body counts than they were actually KIAs of their own. Mm. So I think I began to feel, as a number of guys around me began to feel, that we were being used somewhat in like we were on a chessboard. Yeah. Just to see if these guys' plans would work out. Mm-hmm. So I had my differences with quite a few of them. I had one company commander that hated college boys. He publicly said that in formation every day, and tried to make all of us that were college graduates, tried to make our lives as miserable as possible. And in certain instances he did, but he got paid back. Yeah. None of us ever harmed him, but we did our best to drive him nuts, mm-hmm. because we knew he didn't like us to begin with, and we didn't necessarily care for him either.
During any of your combat experiences, did you have any experiences in mud?
Yeah, it's a little different than a desert climate than people are dealing with today, but dirt is really dirt, mm-hmm. and being unclean is really being unclean regardless of where you were. Mm-hmm. Your mind sort of plays tricks on you over the years, but I walked in uniforms that actually rotted off, so that if you would have come upon us, mm-hmm. come around the bend in the road and seen us standing alongside the road, you would have thought, well, what pigsty did these guys come out of? Yeah. And didn't have a lot of opportunity to bathe. Mm-hmm. So I came back with a lot of skin disease, probably, gosh, I went to the VA for that for 3 or 4 years before I got it. Okay. And it's real easy when you're dirty to disregard your weapons and all this other kind of stuff. So, a lot of guys got harmed or died because they just got lazy. Mm-hmm. And then you had these officers that, after being 10 days in the field, never having a bath and not having a hot meal, these battalion guys would fly in on their choppers and wonder why we didn't look better, and make a shave and that sort of thing. And those things over the course of time become a game anyhow. But actually, the more quickly you figure that out, mm-hmm. the better able you are to play the game. Yeah. Because one of our favorite phrases there, you want to discipline me, I remember this would get repeated 100 times a day. What are you going to do, send us to Vietnam? Yeah. What do you may have heard that. So what are you going to do, send us to Vietnam? I mean, that swept the armed services in Vietnam. Like, well, do whatever you're going to have to do. I know some guys that committed crimes, mm-hmm. to get sent to the stockade, so they could get out of the field. Wow. Because everyone, like in any other situation in life, everybody has their own mental breaking point. Some people are tougher, some people are weaker, mm-hmm. in terms of dealing with what they have to deal with. And you never know what kind of person you are until you get into that situation. I mean, like I said earlier, I think there's no way I could even imagine that I did some of the things that I did. I know I did them. Yeah. They'll come up in stories years later with some of these guys that I still talk to. Mm-hmm. And I still find myself sitting there in amazement saying, gosh, did I really do that? Proud of the fact that I did it, but still amazed that I really did it.
What was it like when you came back home? There was a lot of, arguments between societies on whether we should have been there or not. And
yeah, I sensed right away that not just in the Army, but in society in general. And this was going on inside my own family, and on inside my wife's family. There was all this questioning and argumentative stances were being taken about, were we right, were we wrong, we should have been there, we shouldn't have been there, we won, we didn't win. And I think society in general was just so upset about it that they forgot to stop and say thank you to the men and women that were there. Now, granted, there weren't that many women, but there were some. And I'm convinced, I'm pretty active in Veterans Affairs here in the Senator State. I'm convinced that if society in general would have taken the time, whether on an individual basis, an individual community basis, an individual friend basis, to say, might not have been the prettiest situation, but we know you did what you had to do and we appreciate that. That would have done a lot to ease this pent-up anger that was going on inside of Vietnam, veterans' lives at the time. And it's sort of ironic that we've now got to be older guys and all of a sudden and I'm not saying this is wrong, but there are welcome home ceremonies and there are special days for us, and we're finally getting recognized and all that's great, but I think the general sentiment would be from not only most veterans, but most people that live through that, that it's a long time coming. But again, most of us did what we had to do, and we didn't do it really. And I don't think actually most veterans do what they have to do to get thanked for it. But it sure doesn't hurt.
Yeah. Well, I think that's about all. I'd like to thank you for coming and doing this interview.
Well, I appreciate somebody your age being interested enough to do this. I hope that when you're my age, one of the things that you remember are these interviews. Because Vietnam guys are now, I think there were something like 3.5 million Vietnam veteran era people, meaning that in that whole chaotic time, there were 3.5 million people that served in the armed forces at that time. So not everybody went to Vietnam. But our stories now, as the World War II guys, the men and women are dying off, our stories are going to be the stories for legacy, and I appreciate the fact that you're part of a group here at Glenville to do that.
And I'd also like to thank you for your service.
I appreciate that. I really do. I've learned to accept that now, because for a long time people didn't know how to say that. And it every time somebody does, I might forget about it tomorrow, but it means a lot to me right now.